Hey everyone, I'm Robert from Machado Visuals, and here's a quick breakdown from another dating show I did earlier this year. It was centered around this really beautiful location up in Hollywood Hills and provided a lot of the production value for most of the show. One of the things that's really important to figure out in prep is the sun's path so that I can come up with a few ideas of how we're going to end up shaping the light on the day. Just by looking at this overhead map from Sunseeker, I'm able to see that we're going to be backlit for most of the day, which is what we want. You can also see that the sun's elevation angle gets pretty steep right around 1 o'clock, meaning that the sun will be nearly overhead, which is really good to know when we're setting up for some of the outdoor activities. I was able to get a much better visualization of the sun's path using the AR camera on Sunseeker, and normally you do all this on the Tech Scout, but sometimes you're just not always given this luxury. So the first setup I want to talk about is the initial blind date segment where we have both of our talents sit kind of awkwardly close to each other and meet each other while they're blindfolded. Our main challenge was lighting the entire area with enough light because we're literally shooting against a glass wall. So we need a lot of firepower, and we also need to be wary of any reflections that might show up in the glass. I had my key grip set up a huge ladder truss diagonally across the room to use as our anchor point for 3 vortex panels. And the ladder truss was really important because it's basically a goalpost on steroids. So it has the structural rigidity and can support heavy equipment over a large area. We set up another Max Menace arm that held 2 1200Ds and lanterns to give our talent kind of a motivated far side key and also lift up some of the room tone. They were angled slightly upward to give our wide master a little bit of headroom while our host is standing behind the talent. All of those units were just about enough to fend off any blown out highlights, and the sliding doors looked like they had a slight tint to them, and I'd guess they were probably about 1 or 2 stops down. I also rated all the cameras at 1250 EI to add about 2/3 to our highlights. Our next scene leads us to the outdoor jacuzzi, where talent does a really simple one-on-one interview, but this lighting setup probably had the most changes because we had the most inconsistent weather that entire week. One day it'd be super sunny, and another would be totally overcast, and then we even had a few super rainy days. For the most part, we used a 20 by overhead of half soft frost for that really soft glow. And since our sun was coming in slightly from the south, that helped give us a little bit more direction in the face and edge, depending on whose shot you were on. Another approach we had was during this episode, where it started looking off pretty doom and gloom towards the beginning of the episode when we started. And by the time we got to the outdoor segments, the rain had passed and it just became super sunny. In this instance, we simply didn't have the time to rebuild our 20 by because we were on a really tight schedule, so we instead just set up a couple 4K HMIs with a frame of 250 as a kind of frontal fill and let the sun do most of the work as our backlight. It's definitely not perfect, but it still feels natural without the shadows being too overly distracting. In this third variation, it was pretty overcast with scattered clouds, so an overhead frame wouldn't really have done much because we were already having a sort of natural softbox in the sky, so we just set up 2 4Ks bouncing into an 8x Ultra Bounce. All right, so before I get into our last few setups, I want to talk about the other 50% of any good video, which happens to be the sponsor of today's video, Audio. Audio is a music subscription service with a library that's meticulously handpicked for video creators like myself. They feature tracks on everything from Netflix shows to Super Bowl commercials, and the UI is super easy to navigate so that I can find exactly what I'm looking for. I'm a big fan of finding songs using their playlists to evoke a specific mood for whatever I'm working on. And not only does Audio Pro include unlimited music downloads, but they also have over 30,000 high-quality sound effects, such as atmospheric elements and environment ambience that make it really easy to help build immersion in a scene. Audio Pro licenses are already cleared for distribution on any platform, as well as commercial use for client work. And the great thing is that they never expire, so you can just use those assets forever. If you're interested, check out the link in the description and use my code Machado to save 70% off your first year of Audio Pro.
And then we're gonna go 1 second, let Sam drop off on the ladder. She's just gonna stand in his beat.
So one of our indoor activities was this caricature bit where talent would sit back to back and try to describe each other to a caricature artist sitting nearby. I think we ended up being forced inside because of the rain for this segment, so we had to figure out another angle we could use inside the location. And what we ended up doing is using the same room as the initial blind date, just looking the opposite direction. For this, we ended up using a 20-foot goalpost and hung 2 smaller aperture units with those longer strip boxes that they make. I probably wouldn't hang much more on such a long goalpost without any extra support. We didn't want to repo our original ladder truss just for that one segment, so we just used a single piece of speed rail. Outside, we had one of the 4Ks blasting through the window with a little bit of orange to add a little bit of life and texture to the background, since the clouds were fully rolled in and taking away a lot of our ambient levels. Since the airy suns aren't natively weather resistant, we topped it off with a sheet of cello so that none of the water would end up inside the unit, and left the ballast under a covered area so it would stay out of the rain. Also, random side note, on one of my recent videos, I mentioned some of my top items that I always bring with me on set, and I totally forgot to mention my rain gear. A whole setup with waterproof hiking shoes, rain pants, and a rain jacket can get a little pricey, but is worth its weight in gold when you're working outside in a torrential downpour. I also feel way better when I'm actually out there helping my crew after having them work outside in the rain. So for our confessional, we used a standard butterfly setup. You've seen this a million times and it's pretty much my go-to for these sort of beauty-based reality shows. We have a 600D with a full-sized light dome overhead as our key, and then flew in a small shiny bounce as our fill on the bottom. For our hair light, we used a smaller 60X. And if you didn't notice, you can actually see the reflection of our key light in the back window, but I really didn't mind since it was super out of focus and it kind of meshed in with the white room anyway. Adding an egg crate would have helped mitigate this, but you would have seen the pattern in the reflection, and it also would have given our light much more contrast, which is what I didn't want. For this, I prefer having a much softer quality with a wider spread. It's only really noticeable when the outdoor levels start to get low, and we never really ended up shooting that late anyway. Perfect is the enemy of good, and that's something that I'm always reminding myself rather than getting caught up in making the frame absolutely perfect, because sometimes you end up getting nothing done as a result. Whenever I catch myself getting too nitpicky, I always think back to Star Wars Episode 4, where Luke is making his trench run and turns off his targeting computer.
Luke, you switched off your targeting computer. What's wrong?
Nothing. I'm all right.
To me, it's about taking a step back and looking at the bigger picture and asking myself how it feels rather than relying on absolute technical proficiency. So when you're lighting your next project, just use the force. Most of our other scenes use different sized overhead frames, and all of the walk-ups and hero shots use some sort of Hollywood bounce or far-by frame since they were pretty on the fly. There wasn't a ton of neg in play since the show is very beauty-driven and we're going after a very high-key look. These drops are always super fun because the crew is super skilled and they're also just a bunch of goofballs. Huge thanks to Audio for sponsoring this video and keeping breakdowns like this free on YouTube, but if you want to see more from this project, I'll be posting some full-length BTS over on Patreon. Shout out to Jake for earning a couple Is That a Red stickers from my last video, so slide in my DMs and I'll be sure to send some out. If you want some for yourself, just leave a comment down below with how you might have approached some of the scenes from this show differently. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.